having just gone through the Panama Canal, I want to understand a bit about why the Panama Canal is important. You know, obviously it's big. It's one of the world's main arteries for shipping. And because of that, one of the world's main arteries for commerce and for globalization. And I want to understand at what cost do we have the Panama Canal. Now my first impressions of the Panama Canal are obviously that it's quite amazing. I would say it's interesting. It's not fascinating. If you've ever seen a canal before, then it's kind of like an ordinary canal in Leicestershire or in Holland, but this is bigger. Obviously the ships that go through it are bigger. It's impressive. But it works on fairly general principles. The thing I found beautiful about it was the Culebra Cut, and I'll call it the Culebra Cut and not by the American name. That's beautiful when you go through there, just a beautiful landscape. And Gatun Lake, that's beautiful, although I dare say it would have been beautiful before, with or without being flooded. Amazing, amazing geography of land, amazing, amazing rainforest. But at what cost did that view and that passageway get created? And with the Culebra Cut, for example, we know that that's what, 8 continuous miles of solid rock that they blasted through. And when they blasted through that rock, it took them years, obviously. And the initial French excavations from about 1880 failed because it was just too much to blast through that rock. And the French only did it for a few years and then failed. But by the time they were done, they had killed, what, over 22,000 of their workers, mainly black workers from the West Indies. 22,000 people died creating that Culebra Cut. And they died partly because at that time, at the end of the 19th century, at the beginning of the 20th century, people didn't even understand what caused malaria. They had an idea that it was created by insects, so they, when they took people to hospital, they put the legs of the hospital beds in pans of water so that insects couldn't get in and crawl up the beds. But of course the pans of water were ideal to breed mosquitoes. So they bred mosquitoes, so if you weren't really sick when you went into hospital, you were really sick or dead by the time you came out of it. And now the Americans who took over the French effort, it has to say, they did much better. They only managed to kill, what, over 5,000 of their men. Again, mainly black from the West Indies. So they only killed, what, 1 in 13 of their workforce. Whereas every year the French had about 20,000 people working on it, and that's the amount they killed overall. So in 10 years they killed 100% of their annual workforce. So it was a tremendous human cost that the Panama Canal was forged. And it does something tremendous. It connects Holland with Japan. It connects France with Australia. It connects New York with California. So it does this incredible thing. But the human cost was incredible. But it's not just a human cost that happened then in history. And it was recent history, it was only 110 years ago. The American era of the canal building got underway. But that didn't just take a vast effort in terms of machinery at a time when electricity was new, at a time when bulldozers were brand new. It took a vast political project. And it's that political project today which was, in some ways, unfortunately, entirely successful. It was a project commerce, and it was a project of globalization. And that globalization and the effects of globalization, the ship that we're on now, the merchant vessel Le Trésor, with the CMA CGM French line, carrying what, 65,000 tons of cargo in these containers, and is carrying it from Europe via New York to Australasia through the Panama Canal. And this was the vision of Simón Bolívar, that arch centralist, hailed as the guy who brought independence to Latin America, certainly to South America. But an incredible centralist and in many ways a conservative. And it was the vision of Teddy Roosevelt. And it's that globalization that even today it's bringing things that maybe we don't need as much as we might think they need. We need them. Bringing things from China, from the workshops, from the sweatshops of China, to the shores of Australia, to the shores of Latin America, to the shores of Europe, to Britain. It's that project of globalization which is ongoing. What that does, what this great artery of the Panama Canal does, is open up the world. And we're used to hearing that that's such a good thing, those free markets. But in today's era, what free markets, what free trade has done, is it's created a rule that if you can get something cheaper, you must get it cheaper. If you can get something, some little toy, some little trinket, some little piece of crap, if you can get that cheaper in China, free trade says that you have to go and get it cheaper in China. So you do. And this ship and the Panama Canal lets that happen. So that what that does is that takes the wages, the slave wages, very often, of those Chinese workers, underpaid, abused, it gets them making stuff, and it gets not really you, the consumer, benefiting, but the middleman and the capitalist, the big corporations benefiting, in a race to the bottom, because the rule says if it can be made cheaper, it must be made cheaper. And inherent in this rule is that somebody's always got to be poor, and somebody always will be poor in this system, because if somebody's not poor, then you're not getting some money out of it. The middleman's not getting more money out of it, and the corporations aren't getting more money out of it. Somebody has to be poor, somebody has to be kept down. Otherwise the system won't work. It won't be a race to the bottom. It destroys local markets, it destroys international markets, it destroys national markets, and it destroys a national government's control of its own economy. In this era, at the beginning of the 21st century, national governments aren't really in control of our economies, because we're subject to this rule, to this tyranny that isn't anything really to do with democracy. It's a rule where a rule becomes absolute, it becomes a tyranny. And we live not under democracy really anymore. We have a semblance of democracy, but we live under this tyranny of this rule of the so-called free market. If you can get something cheaper, it has to be made cheaper. And that destroys British jobs, it destroys American jobs, it destroys national jobs, it destroys the national government's control of our economy, of our nation, of our country. All for the sake of this international rule. And the only people that benefit, ultimately, are multinational corporations who exist essentially at an international level, above the rule of law of any nation state of any one country. And that's exactly what Teddy Roosevelt had in mind when over 100 years ago they opened up this canal. And the opening up of this canal was done, dare I say, in a very American way, in a very free trade kind of way. And for me, it exposes what free trade was always about, what free trade always had behind it, which was, in a sentence, the threat of force and the use of force. So just over 100 years ago, when the Panama Canal was gotten underway by the Americans who took over the initial French effort, how they did it was through the use of force. At that time, Panama was not Panama. Panama did not exist as a country. Panama was not going to exist as a country. Panama was a province and had always been a province of Colombia. French effort was taking place on land leased from the Colombian government by the French. Now the Americans, and especially with the interest of a Wall Street consortium, including and especially JP Morgan, people who are still around today, they took the French lease and they bought it off them. They negotiated a lease with the Colombian government. The Colombian Senate wouldn't pass it. They didn't like the idea of the Americans having all that control. So what the Americans did, with the help of the chief engineer, Philip Brunel Varisha, the chief engineer of the French operation, he acted as the Americans' point man. And with American money, Brunel Varisha funded, organized and instigated Panamanian rebels, because there was a degree of Panamanian separatist sentiment against Colombia, which was quite a long way away on the other side of that rainforest, the Darien Gap, and a sail across the Caribbean Sea of a few days from the coast of mainland Colombia. And they took advantage of that distance, the Panamanian rebels and the chief engineer, Brunel Varisha, and the Americans. With American money, they funded and organized, just as the Americans funded and organized 60 years later in Guatemala, the so-called Guatemalan rebellion against the democratically elected government and president of Guatemala, who happens to be a socialist. They had a so-called token Panamanian rebellion force, and on a day, November the 13th, 1903, the rebels took control, and then the US Navy, with 2 ships, in what coined the phrase gunboat diplomacy, they cut off the Colombian Navy coming to rescue their own country from being taken over, and the American Navy cut them off. And they used American money to bribe some of the Colombian forces already in Panama City, and then the rest were easily defeated. And that's how Panama got created. Philippe Brunel Varisha went straight away, with the blessing of the new ad hoc Panamanian rebel government. He went directly to Washington DC, and before the ink was dry, a week later, on the paper setting up the new Panamanian rebel republic, Brunel Varisha came back, ostensibly on behalf of those Panamanian rebels, with a signed contract from Washington DC setting up the canal. A contract that the new Panamanian rebels, the new interim government, weren't even happy with. But they didn't really have any choice but to accept it. And what that contract gave the Americans was perpetual use of the canal zone. It cut out a 10-mile wide stretch of the canal zone from the Atlantic to the Pacific, and gave it totally lock, stock and barrel to the US. It gave the US perpetual right to have a military presence in the canal zone, and it was owned by the US. It was not part of Colombia, it was essentially part of the United States of America in Central America. Clever, eh? And that state of affairs existed up until the late 1970s with the Jimmy Carter Torrijos Treaty. And Jimmy Carter, a Democratic president at that time, there was enough sentiment in the world where America had to be seen to be democratic both at home and abroad. They wanted to hand over control. It was a bit embarrassing that in the 1970s the USA still owned a part of Central America. They wanted to give it back. They wanted to let the Panamanians take hold of it. And so they set up a handover that wouldn't and didn't even take effect until the very first minute of the 21st century. So for all of the 20th century, the Panama Panama Canal was not owned by Panama, was barely owned by Colombia, but was owned completely by the United States of America for the interests of the commerce of the United States of America and for the interests as this vast engine and facilitator of globalization. And of course at the time there was a lot of, there was still resistance in the US Senate that this should go through. The Republicans didn't want it to happen. They feared that the Panamanians were in hock to the Chinese, and in the end the Panamanians did give some of the commercial contracts for the running of the port to a Chinese consortium because the Chinese were good at it. You know, that's how free trade works. You give contracts to the people who can do it, and the people who are the cheapest. The Republicans didn't like that, but as one Republican in the Senate put it at the time, we should not give it back because, as he said, we stole it fair and square. And he was totally serious about that. We stole it. We stole the Panama Canal fair and square. We don't need to give it back. We shouldn't give it back. We don't want these Panamanians to have it. As it happens, the Panamanians have done a very good job at the technical administration of the Panama Canal. And they're making a lot of money out of it, and I guess that's how it should be. They're in some ways crazily proud. The Panamanian people are proud of something that they didn't really create, and something which not only was the engine of the creation of their nature through the creation of their nation through violence and through trickery and through bribes, but has in some ways controlled and ruined their nation throughout the 20th century. So throughout the 20th century, Panama was controlled by dictators. And this was never really any of the concern of the United States. The United States didn't really seem to care throughout all of the 20th century that Panama suffered and the Panamanian people suffered. Dictator after dictator after dictator, and oppression after violence after oppression. Murders and disappearances. This wasn't a problem because the canal kept going and the canal wasn't threatened. And Ronald Reagan was already an outspoken opponent in the 1970s, in the era of the treaty, of the canal being given back to Panama. It was Reagan in 1989, as president, who invaded Panama to oust Noriega, because, you know, there's one thing about a dictator that is under control and another thing about a dictator who isn't under control. And Noriega wasn't under control, and therefore he had to go. And the United States took it upon themselves to invade a different country and oust its president as late as 1989. And of course, under the terms of the Canal Treaty, they had a right, a totally legal right, at least to have a military presence in the Canal Zone. And that is the history of the Panama Canal, and that's the history of the effect of the Panama Canal. Something that was born out of the demands of commerce, out of the demands of globalization, out of the desire for free trade. And a free trade that is creating a tyranny. A free trade that's creating a tyranny of not democracy, but a race to the bottom, where we're not in control of our economy, we're not in control of the world economy. This single idea, this single rule, and the tyranny and the tyrannous application of this rule was applied by the World Trade Organization, the IMF, the World Bank. The tyranny of this single rule of so-called free and open markets is the engine for all of this, which loses us jobs, and control of our economy, and control of democracy. We've not seen democracy in Panama, we've not seen democracy in Central America, we've not really seen democracy in the United States, we're not seeing democracy in the world and in our own countries, like my country, Britain. Because of the way that international trade and this idea, this lie of free markets, which is really a tyranny, controls what goes on in the world. And that is, to me, what the Panama Canal represents. What the history of Panama is unfortunately all about. Not a history of the people in Panama, a history of the canal, created for the canal. A nation born out of bloodshed and trickery and lies and deceit and money. Money on Wall Street and money today in Panama City through the middlemen and money through the corporations. That's the story of Panama and what an important effect it has on the world.